right.
Oh man, welcome to the Where Is Now podcast, episode 6. I'm Billy Bunton, my partner is Jesse Freeston on the other side of the screen for episode 6. We've done 5 episodes together now, Jesse, and just a bit about our format. Every week we go back and forth. One of us has to make a case for the impact of a person, an idea, a movement, anything, an impact in this world, and the other comments and learns and discusses. So welcome.
Yeah, and it could be somebody who's having that impact or somebody that we feel like should have that impact, and today somebody that did have that impact, maybe he's not having it anymore, and maybe with the power of this podcast we will bring them back to their rightful place as a model person for us.
That's right.
Potentially. I'm gonna make that case. We'll see if Billy's convinced.
We'll see. We'll see, Jesse. What do you got for us out here?
Okay, well, first up, to bring us into this, I want to talk about a comment that was made, which I think the response to is a really good sign of progress. Drew Brees made a comment that I think a few years ago would have been in the media landscape mostly uncontroversial, and now is a massive controversy in which he is forced to apologize immediately.
What do you think about his apology? Well, actually, maybe we should just talk about what he
yeah, so Billy's the football guy. Billy's the football guy. For anybody who didn't catch that on the Michael Jordan episode, Billy played for Stony Brook University.
The Stony Brook University.
Sorry, I always forget the D. That's really important to you guys.
My cat is wilding, by the way. Let me just put her down.
It's the Stony Brook Wildcats.
No. The Stony Brook Seawolves, baby.
Seawolves? The fuck is a seawolf?
Don't even. Drew Brees is an NFL quarterback, Hall of Famer to be, has an amazing arm and touch, and is just a great talent, and is well loved in the community. Actually, he plays for the New Orleans Saints, and he's well loved as someone who is a pillar in that community and like supports people, the low-income communities in New Orleans, and people who suffered during and after Hurricane Katrina and other things pertinent to that region. I mean, he's beloved for all this. So it was a big shock when recently he was kind of caught in a controversy.
Everyone is looking back now at Kaepernick's protests from a few years ago, and obviously they were always about police brutality, and now it's coming back to the fore, and a lot of people expect that we will see players kneeling again if and when the NFL season starts. I'm curious how you think the NFL will and should respond to that.
I will never agree with anybody disrespecting the flag of the United States of America or our country. Let me just tell you what I see or what I feel when the national anthem is played and when I look at the flag of the United States. I envision my 2 grandfathers who fought for this country during World War II, one in the Army and one in the Marine Corps, both risking their lives to protect our country and to try to make our country and this world a better place. So every time I stand with my hand over my heart, looking at that flag and singing the national anthem, that's what I think about. And in many cases, it brings me to tears.
And he had to walk it back. He was really kind of roundly criticized for it. And he's walked it back and clarified, and he's reached out to people like the guy you're about to play, like Shannon Sharpe, and they had a conversation that Shannon's been pretty vocal about too. So
Shannon Sharpe, also a Hall of Famer. Brees will probably be a Hall of Famer, right? He's the all-time leader in passing and stuff. And so
yes,
this is a Hall of Famer criticizing a Hall of Famer to be.
The military that you valiantly speak of has been very disrespectful for the black man. Because even the GI Bill, when it came home and blacks were supposed to be allowed to get money and to buy nice homes, that wasn't how it happened, Skip. The medals that they fought for and won for bravery and valor and heroism, they didn't get those. They had to fight for them, and a lot of them was awarded those medals posthumously, meaning they got their flowers after they were dead. Where white men was coming home and getting medal after medal after medal. And Drew somehow thinks that the flag is supposed to mean the exact same thing for a black man as a white man. when this country has never been the same for a black man as a white man. Drew, what country do you live in? You live in a country that has afforded you privileges and luxury that the black man has never been afforded and received. And you're so set in your ways that you were unwilling. Skip, I remember I told you, Skip, the man that can't see isn't the blindest. It's the one that chooses not to see. Drew Brees chooses to make this about the flag as opposed to the plight of the unarmed black men and women being killed in this America.
Here's the quote: "The blindest is not the one who cannot see, but the one who chooses not to see." And today I want to talk about a woman who chose to see even though physically she could not, who chose to hear even though physically she was unable to. Today I'm going to make the case for Helen motherfucking Keller.
Oh, shit.
As a timeless role model for allyship and progress. Yeah.
I'm interested to hear this case, man.
When I say Helen Keller, Billy, like what comes to mind?
Helen Keller, what comes to mind? A young girl who's blind, deaf, who's lacking several of the senses that we all take for granted, and somehow emerged from that, with the ability to express like great ideas, about humanity. And she's just she exemplifies kind of like struggle and success over like difficult odds. And other than that, really, I know very little else. I know the historical context as well around her and the time of her life. But anyway, I'm excited for this case because I can't call myself a Helen Keller expert at all.
Well, I wasn't either, but I picked up like everything Helen Keller ever wrote to get into this, because Helen Keller was always this fascinating person for me. Like I love jokes and just the only thing I knew about Helen Keller growing up, I didn't know anything she did. I just knew that she was deaf and blind, and there was all these terrible Helen Keller jokes that I thought were hilarious as a kid.
Right.
And
I remember some of those.
Yeah, do you remember it? Do you remember any right now?
I'm trying to remember one. Hold on. I can't remember right now.
They're terrible. There's one. It was like, how did Helen Keller burn her hand? And it was because she was trying to read the waffle iron. Like there's just like,
oh my
just
god,
like a lot
yeah,
of
stuff like that.
ones.
Yeah, I remember. Like I don't. Yeah.
There was one. It was like, why didn't Helen Keller scream when she fell off a cliff? And it was because she was wearing mittens.
Oh man.
And it was just really terrible stuff. And there was way worse ones than that. And actually, I'm going to get into that a little later. But that was like, I loved those little jokes when I was a kid, and I loved all jokes like that. And then, but when I got older and I found out that she was this activist who had been kind of censored, that she was this person that was so highly celebrated when she stuck to talking about her own life and her own struggles, and then as soon as she started to talk about broader social things, they were like, cut the mic, she doesn't know what she's talking about.
Enough.
And I've been meaning to get into a little bit of like how she arrived at her larger political beliefs and without being able to see or hear, and how that would affect kind of her worldview. And so this is what I've been into for the past week. I've been trying to figure this out. So just a few things about an introduction to Helen's world. Helen's name comes from the Greek word eleni, which means light. Something she can't perceive, which is interesting. And in ancient Greece, blindness alone, not just being blindness and deaf, but blindness alone was considered justification for parents to kill their children. So just like to give a sense of where at least the Western civilization has come. There's the same in Rome as well. In terms of Western civilization coming and the achievements of people with disability and stuff like that, that's where this great light of democracy of Greece was when it came to people who were blind. And then Helen's born blind and deaf.
Was it just deaf and blind, Jesse? Was there? I thought that I'm sure this isn't the appropriate term, but I thought it was blind, deaf, and dumb. Is that true?
And dumb.
Or no?
Well, so dumb meaning you can't speak.
Exactly. It's not the appropriate.
She did learn to speak. So we could say there was a time when she was considered blind, deaf, and dumb. but she did learn to speak. Yeah, which is another massive achievement.
That's crazy.
Which we probably won't even get to amongst all the massive achievements. So it's believed that in the 20th century, there was less than 50 children in the world who were both blind and deaf. And it's a pretty rare combination to end up with both. And Helen fell ill at 19 months. She was born healthy, and she got what they believe was probably scarlet fever when she was 19 months old, and lost both her sight and her hearing 100%, like zero perception in either sense. She was so angry and destructive as a child. She used to set fires. She dumped her newborn sister out of the crib. She would routinely smash dishes or anything she could get her hands on. She locked her mom in a closet for hours one time. Her mom told a friend once, "Fate has ambushed the joy in my heart and left it dead."
Fate.
This fate, like the fate of her daughter losing these senses. One of the worst days of Helen's life, she says, is when she happened to have her hands on two people's faces at the same time and realized that they were moving their mouths like in concert. So like one was talking, then the other was talking. So like that was the moment she realized that the rest of the world was communicating and she couldn't be part of it. And she said she kicked and screamed that day until she literally exhausted herself and had no energy left. And the other thing is, the thing that's important here is like, you know, you could say like, oh, I'm going to put earplugs in, I'm going to cover my eyes, and I'll spend a whole day like that, and then I'll get a sense of what life was like for Helen Keller as a kid. But you still wouldn't come even close, because first of all, you know at some point you're going to be able to take it off again. Second, the environment you've probably already seen it, which is a huge advantage. And the third thing is, and this is the key thing, is you know the meaning of words, which is such a strange thing to point out, but you'll see that this was the challenge of Helen's upbringing, and this is like, I think is like a really beautiful part of the story too. Is just like how much words were an absolutely necessary thing for her to become the person that she was, and she was 7 years old when she first learned of the existence of words, that like the things that she was bumping into and touching and had a word associated with them, and that they related to each other, and she calls that the day that her teacher gave her her soul.
Wow.
And so I just wanted to add a couple of things. Her biographer said Helen's challenges would have crushed anyone less stoic, Billy's keyword, adaptable, and protected. So stoic and adaptable being, you know, qualities that people can develop as individuals, and protection being something that your society affords you. Yeah. And so Helen was born in Alabama to a former captain of the Confederate Army, a former slave-holding family which still had black servants living with them. They weren't considered one of the wealthier families in Alabama, but they definitely had wealth. They had land, and they have people living and working for them, you know, serving them. Her dad had become the editor of the local newspaper, but wasn't considered particularly bright and would eventually lose that job. And that's when things got a little messy in the house. But so it's interesting that so I just wanted to point that out. So stoic, adaptable, or open-minded, go with the flow, and protected. And so
that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Really interesting set of choices there. Yeah, those make a lot of sense to me. You know, the Stoicism speaks to a mindset that can help you make sense of things, and then adaptable is like makes sense as well. But yeah, the other part that isn't, it's a stroke of luck. You know, it speaks to the duality of like that whole question of nature versus nurture. But that, you know, some of this is not pertain to you. The whole self-made man, self-made individual is a bit of a joke.
Yeah, and this is her story really points out like just how she roundly and routinely rejected being reduced to just a story of personal triumph, and how she became a social activist, a fighter, so that everybody could get that protection that had allowed her to flourish in her situation. And I think it points to this false choice, which is the false choices that, you know, that we've talked about before, you know, with Michael Jordan and stuff. It's like, you either believe that people make of their lives what they make of them, regardless of the hand that's dealt to them. And maybe even you live in denial about the hand that you've been dealt or that others have been dealt and things like this. And you see this in like the celebration online all the time of people like Morgan Freeman, you know, when they'll say stuff like racism only exists if we say it does, you know, look at me, I've got a great career, let's just stop talking about it. And they're celebrated for that perspective. You know, and Helen Keller is just a great example of a person who found a way, you know, with the help of a visionary and very patient teacher, to go much further than any person of her time with her challenges ever had, or ever, period, probably, maybe. But did so in a way that didn't leave others behind. You know, did so in a way that didn't say, look, I did it, just do what I did. You know, she always used her voice, or her words, I guess would be a better way of putting it, although she did use her voice near the end of her life, to fight for a fairer deck of cards, I guess we could call it, for everybody. And
you know what strikes me real quick? Can I jump in on the
of
you
course,
know, as you describe her, just the early blurb that you've given us, the moment she realizes that people are communicating by touching the mouths and seeing them. Wow, like I'd love to get into the concept of communicating, and I know we will. Just as a concept, what it means and what it does. That must have been crazy to figure that out after just dealing with, I guess, darkness and nothingness. I don't know what it sounds like, I suppose, right? But and then to notice that there's something else, and there are people exchanging images and ideas and sounds, and that you've been left out of that. Wow. Anyway.
Yeah, and so why don't we go to this clip from this 1962 movie called The Miracle Worker, which covers like the first 8 years or 7 years of Helen's life, and particularly her relationship with her teacher, Anne Sullivan, who we'll get into later, who's a necessary person to talk about in this story. None of this happens without her, and so yeah, I'm just gonna like talk us through this clip a bit, just because a lot of this movie happens without words. So those who are listening as a podcast won't get much out of the clip. So the first voice you're gonna hear is Anne Sullivan, her teacher, talking to Captain Keller, Helen Keller's dad.
I don't think Helen's worst handicap is deafness or blindness. I think it's your love and pity. All of you are so sorry for her, you've kept her like a pet. Or even a dog, you housebreak.
And so what you see here is Helen. This is Anne's first night in the house, and they're eating dinner. And she sees how the family lets Helen just wander around the table, bothering people, eating directly off the table. And then when she comes to put her hands on Anne's plate, Anne just grabs her and says, "Hell no. Like, I'm going to treat you." And this whole thing is all about how she's, from the beginning, Anne's like, "No, you're going to be treated like a normal child. And we're going to figure out how you're going to exist in this world like everybody else. And you're not going to be treated like a pet," as she says to Helen's parents. So even dogs get house trained. And it leads to this really tough love. And this scene is like straight out of WWF. You see, just trying to force the kid to learn how to eat with a spoon. And just this is I think it's one of the most epic scenes I've ever seen in film. This scene goes on for like, I'm just cutting pieces. It goes on for like 10 minutes of just, they must have been exhausted filming this thing. And look at this, and in this moment she turns around and she thinks she's won, and she spits the food right in her face. No, it's just it's just epic. I mean, it's 1962. I'm sure this scene would be criticized as horrible child abuse if it was to come out in 2020.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then here's the quote at the end.
What happened? She ate from her own plate. She ate with a spoon, herself, and she folded her napkin.
Folded her napkin?
The room's a wreck, but her napkin is folded.
Love that.
Yeah.
That's tight. Wow.
Isn't that an epic quote at the end?
That is amazing, yeah.
The room's a
Wow.
wreck, but her napkin is folded.
Why does that take me back to Michael Jordan? Right?
Yeah?
Like, had to be a bit of an asshole for a moment there, I guess. I want to hear more about the context around that, but it seems, there's a kind of, I hate the term tough love, because it seems to me like a cliche or something, but it's purely, it's not tough for toughness sake. The point isn't to be tough. The point is to assert something even when it's difficult. And so it is to say that that's the goal. So even when, like the quote at the end, the room's a mess, but the goal was to fold the napkin. We got that done. And in order to do that, there was a bit of a brouhaha. But that was a necessary condition for the goal. And I think that's inspiring. It brings me back to Michael Jordan. And sometimes it means that some people will, Helen didn't like her at first, I'm sure. So yeah.
And it's there's there's the difference between having pity for somebody and having expectations for that person. You know what I mean? Like I think we need to have expectations for each other.
Yes.
And then you try to live up to those expectations. And especially the younger you are, the more you need others to put those expectations on you. The harder it is for you to self-generate those expectations and try to live up to them,
You don't have a frame of reference. You know nothing, And so those of us who, clearly for her family was able to afford a teacher of that caliber was an advantage, and a very lucky advantage, that so many like her will never even dream to have, even today, even by today's standards. Yeah. So.
Okay, now we're going to get into the second clip here from the film, from The Miracle Worker, 1962. One of the interesting things to point out about the name of the film is that both Anne and Helen hated people talking about anything to do with their story as miracles. Like, it's like they're on the record numerous times in the 1900s, in the 1910s, in the 1920s, talking about rejecting this frame, because they put in so many hours and so much work, and it made me think about like Einstein, how he would always reject the title of genius when he would say, if you saw how much work it was, you would never call it genius. Right. But anyways, Hollywood is like, yeah, we're just going to call it The Miracle Worker. And then they simplify a whole bunch of other things about the story too. Like the opening scene is basically like a newborn Helen crying, and it's like, oh no, she's blind and deaf, and the mother freaking out, realizing she can't see or hear. But really it happened when she was 19 months. And I can't imagine, Helen was still alive, I think, when this film came out. And I can't imagine them having to explain to Helen, yeah, we changed this about the story and this about the story, when she's never seen a movie. It's like, well, you have to understand, movies have to, play a little bit with
That's crazy.
Might have been a weird situation. But so we're going to get now to the, sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say they always do that. So Hollywood is infamous for doing that, right? Because their whole business is telling stories, and they have formats and formulas that they think works for them. But I think just generally, there's this tendency to simplify stuff. And I don't know why that is. Why call something a miracle? To me, I find it's an effort to, if someone does something really noteworthy and we don't want to do the work to think about the process, it's like miracle. You throw in, it's like the God principle, you throw in an inexplicable event, when in fact that's kind of insulting. It's like, and you see it all the time with like LeBron James, for instance, who is just a hardworking man ever since, a young boy, but he gets reduced to a phenom, a physical phenom, which he is as well, but
it's important to note for those of us who also worked really hard and didn't make it to that level, that it's like, well, if we were 6'9", born with that frame, and it's like we would have had certain advantages. It's good to know about the phenomenal aspects of his physicality, but to reduce him to that is a terrible tragedy, I think. And an injustice to him and all the work he put in. Okay, so here's another clip from 1962 the miracle worker. And this is
Helen
now we're
learns
getting
words?
into, and this is now we're getting into how Anne Sullivan taught Helen Keller how to speak. And the language you're going to see here that she's using is called the manual alphabet. So it's basically like there's a hand shape for each letter. Some of them are, like pretty obvious, like that, like a B is kind of like what a B looks like, but then some of them aren't recognizable as the letter, but it's a manual alphabet.
I taught her one thing. No, don't do this, don't do that.
That's more than all of us could do in all the
I
years.
wanted to teach her what language is. I know without it to do nothing but obey is no gift. Obedience without understanding is a blindness too. Is that all I've wished on her? I wanted to teach you. Oh, everything the earth is full of, Helen. Everything on it, it's ours for a wink and it's gone. And what we are on it. The light we bring to it and leave behind in words. Well, you can see 5,000 years back in the light of words. Everything we feel. Think. Know and share in words. So not a soul is in darkness, or done with even in the grave. How do I tell you that this means a word, and the word means this thing, woe. Round. Yes!
Wow.
So that
Yikes.
that scene is pretty close to the how it's described in Helen's autobiography, her first of two autobiographies. And at that moment, so water is the first time she realizes that these strange symbols that Anne's putting into her hand are letters that build words that refer to real things in reality. And it's that moment with water. And that's where she writes in her autobiography, she says, "That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. There were barriers still, but barriers that could be in time swept away. Everything now had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought. I saw everything with the strange new sight that had come to me." And then one of these dolls that she had smashed earlier in the day, when she was trying to teach her the word for doll, she came back and she found the doll smashed on the ground. So she learned 30 words that day in her first day. And that's what you see in the clip where she's learning about tree and she's learning about these other things.
Yeah.
And then she came back and found this doll that she'd smashed, and her eyes filled with tears. And she said, quote, "For the first time I felt repentance and sorrow." And so it's like, it's hard for me to get my head around. This is like a 7-year-old. This is so many years after kids are developing their relationships and developing their understandings of things and dealing with all the different emotions. And up until this point, she's mostly only just felt anger and fear and hasn't been able to develop any of these other things. And then words unlock this whole human experience for her. And it's wild. And she says, "It would have been difficult to find a happier child than I was at the end of that eventful day. For the first time in my life, I longed for a new day to come."
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. She has this new awakening, a reckoning, and realizes that she's on the precipice of this like bounty of all of these new words and items and people and things that has escaped her for what, 7 years you said? So she's 7 at this point, or 10?
Yeah, she's 7.
To even just like to have the mind open in that, that's an epiphany, but it sounds like a huge epiphany, one that most of us will never be able to imagine, because we're doing that in a much slower process, from birth to, every little experience with our parents and onward. At 7, that's insane. It's a crazy story.
I don't really remember as a kid like those moments of like having a word unlock something for me and being like, that like, and now I have this tool and now I can ask for this thing, you know, instead of just crying, or like too young to remember that feeling. But as an adult, or like one as a teenager and one as an adult, I can think of two words that made my life better. Like it just allowed me to recognize something. And the first one I remember was indifference. You know, and I remember like learning the concept of indifference as being like a terrible thing, and as being just as responsible for evil in the world as the evil deeds themselves. And it just like as like something to avoid, as something to never be indifferent. I just remember that word having a lot of power for me. It still does. Yeah. And then one, as I became later, which like gave me a lot of freedom, was FOMO. When I found out about the word FOMO.
Fear of missing out?
Yeah, like I think up until finding out about the word FOMO, I would be a difficult person to hang out with one-on-one on a Friday night. Like I think, you know, like I think part of me would have just been twitching a little bit, like, you know, I'm sure there's something really cool going on somewhere, like, oh, you know, let's figure out where the party's at. Like, and finding out that there's this term FOMO, fear of missing out, it's not a good thing, and other people are experiencing it too, and it's really, you know, has a negative effect on kind of your relationships and the quality of the time that you're spending where you're at right now. Right. Just like knowing it existed allowed me just immediately to kind of like get rid of it.
You know what's crazy? So in order to learn it and get rid of it, what it also takes me is, so can you imagine being a young transgender person in the 30s of America, you know? And there's no language, there's no vernacular to understand the feelings that are going on in your body and in your mind. And if anything, it's being subordinated. You're being told that something potentially is wrong with you, right? And then you have this awakening that is still happening. We don't have this awakening yet, but I mean to say that the conversation around gender is so different today. We have language. We have like so many different lists of genders. As people are attempting to understand the phenomena of gender and sexuality, it's completely different. You're different. And I'm not a transgender person, so I don't want to speak for the community, but I want to say, I can say that's something that, like, I don't know, if you're someone in different stages of privilege, certain words, this kind of new language isn't something you're seeking, you know what I mean, in the same way. So yeah. you know the world, the stories, the narratives all validate stuff that you know, and you don't have this thing that you have to, like, what is that even, how can I articulate this? And I don't know, the transgender conversation to me exemplifies new words, new language, and just changing the entire complexity of the conversation and giving people a voice, giving people the opportunity to be heard and to be empathized with. I say even on the other end, those people who you know, to be able to understand better with these words. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's got to be hard for people like who have an identity that's not necessarily understood broadly by the mainstream, because when they get interrogated on their identity, it's got to be hard to differentiate between those that are coming at it from a place of love and curiosity, I'll call it, like of like trying to understand your reality, trying to understand what your situation is, what your identity means to you, and what it means, how I should operate around you, like differently or something like this, you know, versus somebody who's coming at it from a desire to put you down or you know, cast shade on your group as a whole or whatever it might be, when they come at you with questions. And like in terms of so trying to differentiate, trying to figure out people's motivation has got to be tough. And to bring it back to Helen Keller, this is somebody who, like, I, as a curious person, like, I always respect curious people. They're my, you know, I can hang out with a curious, active mind for hours, even on a Friday night now, thanks to FOMO.
No more FOMO. Good job.
And like, so here's an example from Helen Keller's autobiography of like the depth of her curiosity. There's two things that make her education kind of privileged in many ways. One is that she has a one-on-one teacher, which is probably hard to imagine a world in which every kid can have a one-on-one teacher every day. It doesn't really make sense numbers-wise. But it does say something about classroom sizes. You know, it's a really negative feature. I remember like I was in grade 6 after they made major cuts, or 6th grade as you guys called it in the US, when they made major cuts in the Ontario school system in Canada, and we had like 36 kids in the class with one teacher, and it's not a really great situation for the teacher or for anybody in terms of trying to get learning done.
That's standard out here in New York, man. 36 growing up, that's what it was for sure. 36, 40 around there.
Yeah, that's not easy. And then the other thing is that they would spend a lot of time outside. So Helen actually talks about how most of my lessons never felt like lessons. Like I never felt like I was in a lesson, but I was learning all the time. So they would go for these long walks.
Oh, because this is just with her teacher. She's not in a classroom. This is her and the teacher.
Right. This is with her teacher. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And later we'll talk about when she goes to university and her critiques of university. But cool. She would learn geography and would like make models of larger geographic things like mountains and rivers in the sand, like on the creek side or whatever, using little rocks, and Helen would run her hand over it and she'd be like, now imagine this, 1,000,000 times bigger or whatever, that's a river. And like she would teach her geography and things like that. And
wow.
Anyway, so they were on one of their walks one day. There was it was Anne, Helen, and one of Helen's cousins, I believe, and they stayed out too long and they were trying to get back before sunset, and so they decided to take a shortcut over a train bridge, so a bridge with only room for a train. And so imagine Helen, she doesn't even explain exactly how it went down in the autobiography, because like I'm trying to imagine this, but so the train's, all of a sudden there's a train coming and they're halfway across the bridge and there's no room on the bridge for them to get out of the way, and I guess Anne has to quickly sign the situation into Helen's hand, and that they're gonna climb down under the bridge and hold on while the steam engine, cast iron, whatever massive train comes over their heads.
This is a true story, Jesse?
This is a true story.
Okay, wow.
Like I said, like the mechanics of exactly how the communication went down that quickly and whatever is not in her autobiography. But she says, as she's hanging under this bridge and the bridge is swaying, she says, I felt the hot breath of the engine on my face, and its smoke and ashes choked us. The bridge swayed, and I was certain we would fall into the chasm below. But I just look like she's having this like poetic reflection on like, this, and she goes on to talk about this massive engine and this. So like she's even in this. It must have been the most terrifying situation. It's like I don't even know if she knows what a train is. You know what I mean? Like I don't even know if they've reached that lesson yet. And
That's
just
crazy.
To have that force of this thing shaking the bridge and the heat coming out of it, like, and she's filled with curiosity even in this moment of like close to deth,
I'm sure with hindsight, I'm sure she wrote that 2 days later.
It
had to, it wasn't like in the moment she's like just making it happen. That's nuts though.
And then when they went to Plymouth Rock at age 8, when she was 8, when they were visiting Massachusetts, and she had just been told that this is where the great men who started America had landed, and they were so brave. And she's writing this now in her early 20s when she's at university at Harvard, and she says, I idealized them as the bravest and most generous men that ever sought a home in a strange land. I thought they desired the freedom of their fellow men as well as their own. I was keenly surprised and disappointed years later to learn of their acts of persecution that tingle us with shame, even when we glory in the courage and energy that gave us our country beautiful. So like, this is somebody who is romantic, like falling in love with ideas of these great men and their great deeds, but then as soon as she is confronted with a narrative that at least gives it another dimension of some of the terrible things they did, she's willing to abandon her other narrative and complicate it.
Yes. I like that. Not even abandon, because you need not abandon, but like incorporate it into your narrative. That goes back to the conversation again. And a lot of times, so she is the recipient of this new information, and what I notice is like based on whether you have like a personal agenda that you may or may not know of, or a fear or a trauma, or you have an attachment, you have an ego thing. It's all these ways that you don't receive the information. You just put up a block, or you find a way to put it away. You say, well, that's a outlier, you know, and you put it into a thing, as opposed to incorporating it and saying, okay, this is now a new reality that I have to deal with, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think I agree with that. And I think just to wrap up kind of Helen's opening to the world, this is a quote from her. She said, "I lived myself into all things." And I've had that just like going around in my head over and over again ever since then. And yeah, so then she goes to university. She becomes one of the first women. So this is at a time when Harvard didn't accept women, so they opened up a college basically with the same curriculum. I don't know if it was exactly the same curriculum, but you could get a Harvard education as a woman. You just had to go to Radcliffe College.
Had to go to who?
And Radcliffe College.
Oh yeah, okay.
So it was because you couldn't be in the same institution as the men, and it was very, very few women, and one of them in the early days was the blind, deaf Helen Keller. And so, you know, this just
crazy
reminds us of the time period we're in, and that like she's also a woman. You know, it's like we're talking the turn of the century.
What is she studying at Harvard or at Radcliffe?
She picked up a bunch of languages. She would study languages, so she spoke French, German, and Latin on top of English.
Can I cut you off for a second? You're someone who's a polyglot. You speak several languages, at least 3, pretty damn fluently.
Yeah. 3. Yeah.
Like, so the idea of like incorporating new words, you know, like I know if I go, my first language is French, but I've since lost a lot of it, and I go back to Guadeloupe and I have something I want to ask my aunt, and that's struggling, and then you get it and you have this, oh yes, you know, and now you're able to communicate that. Like you have that, you're familiar with that.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's fascinating to find a word in another language that just works better for you for whatever reason than the word you have in your first language or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So like I think about in Spanish, like one of my favorite words in Spanish is desahogarse, which is the equivalent of in English we talk about to vent, right? So venting, like when you like me and you, when we're talking, when we're pissed off about something, and we come and we just dump on the other person like all this shit that you're thinking about and what some shitty person did today or whatever it might be. And venting is something where, you know, it's like you're getting out the hot air or whatever, but like venting is something you could just do, in theory, you could just do it all day to everybody all the time. You could just vent as a verb, as a metaphor, right? Whereas desahogarse, ahogar is to drown, desahogar is to undrown, desahogarse makes it reflexive, so it's undrown yourself. Now I don't, like I've talked to a lot of Spanish speakers about this, and I think it's not like when they use it, they think of the metaphor every time. You know what I mean? Like I think they use it in the same way that we use vent. You know, we don't think about the metaphor. But I think about the metaphor because it's not my first language. So like when I learned that, I was like, that is such a cool metaphor. So it's like, instead of just venting whatever, blah, 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 it's like you can't breathe, you're drowning. Like, you know what I mean? You've got this water in your lungs, and then you go and you spit up onto the table all that shit that was stopping you from breathing. And, you know, there's like all this salt water in a bag of Doritos and a boot or whatever the hell you swallowed when you were drowning. And like, and then the other person goes, damn, you had a lot of stuff in there. Like you had a lot of, I can't believe you had a Doritos bag in there. And then just that allows you to breathe now. Yeah. And the power of the word for me is that you do it once. You should only have to do it once, unless it's something terrible. You know what I mean? It's like, unless it's something that's really affecting your life. It's like, for the smaller things, it's like, do it once, feel better. Yeah. You know, like breathe again, you know, and move on. Yeah. Whereas venting, you just do all day.
Implied in it is a cathartic thing, and a psychological, there's a health benefit implied in there, I think. Yeah. Maybe in vent too, right? Like more oxygen and blah, blah, blah. But I like that. Dope.
So she at university,
yes,
one of the things that she was the most pissed off about at university was that there was no time to think, that there was no time to reflect, she was like, we just run around shoving stuff into our heads, and we never reflect on what it means and how it should change our reality. And we're getting all these huge ideas. Her favorite class was philosophy, because and when she explained why, it made total sense. Where it was like, this was a place where she really could connect with everybody else. You know what I mean? Because like philosophy, like, how do you deal with rejection? How do you deal with problems? How do you, it's like, how do you approach the world regardless of your situation or whatever? Like, what are these meta approaches and understandings, and what's real and what's not? And so she can go to battle with any sighted, hearing person in the world of philosophy.
That's crazy.
And in fact, she might be better prepared because contemplation is like her game. That's what she does. A lot of.
If anything, her only disadvantage is she has to operate on the sighted person's plane, like in terms of, I don't know, the things that we're attached to that are visual in nature, that to her she can speak on a different level. She has to kind of come down to us and talk about kind of mundane visual things that we care about. I don't know. Maybe that didn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. And a lot of the writings of philosophy, because they're written by people with sight and hearing, like, are metaphors and things that are more made for people who see and hear. And so, she's definitely, like that. There's challenges for her in the world of philosophy, but she loved it. And this is when she started to really get political, is when she's in university. And it wasn't, she always had, like, from a very early age, and this might have been the influence of Anne, who's her teacher, who had grown up very poor. Basically, most of her siblings died. Her dad was an alcoholic who abandoned the family after her mom died.
This is Anne.
This is Anne.
Okay.
She was Irish at a time when the Irish were not particularly welcome in the United States. So her parents were from Ireland. They had left during the Great Potato Famine, which is a terrible name for a period in history in which the British were continuing to import food from Ireland, and a quarter of the Irish population died, and half the Irish population, if I remember correctly, had to flee the island, mostly to North America. And the British were still importing food. And it's known to history as the Great Famine, or the Great Potato Famine.
Really?
Because the potato crop failed, right? Yeah. But then the British were still importing meat, like into England, while the Irish were dying of starvation. So her parents come over during that time, and like what happens often when a group of immigrants comes over en masse and comes over very poor, is the society that receives them develops a lot of racism towards them. And so Anne was in like the second generation of that anti-Irish sentiment after the famine. And then she ended up actually growing up mostly in a homeless shelter. And she was there with her brother after her alcoholic father abandoned them. And she was partially blind, and her brother died within the first year of being there from tuberculosis. And she was raped many times as a kid living there. It was like she had a really, really terrible thing, and she came out of it with like a real sense of unhappiness with the status quo. And she was infuriated when she arrived in Alabama. So she was from Massachusetts, and she was infuriated when she arrived in Alabama and saw the state of the black servants. And one of the things that you'll see with Anne is that she even doesn't want Helen's parents speaking directly with Helen. She doesn't want to teach them, particularly the father, the manual alphabet. She doesn't want them having an influence on Helen. She doesn't want them passing on their values to Helen.
Because
in large part because of how they see the world, and she was so put off by this situation of the black servants. And so I think this Helen got some of this stuff from Anne, but I think there's some evidence that's inside her too. At age 11, when she starts to become a bit famous, and there's all these articles about her having learned to communicate, somebody sends her $35, which is a lot of money at the time. She immediately sends it to a 5-year-old boy in Pittsburgh named Tommy Stringer, who was deaf and blind and had no money, in order to pay for him to come to Boston and go to the school that had trained Anne, so that he could learn language. So like she's got this sense from a very young age of bringing other people up with her. And so in 1913, she comes out as a socialist with a series of essays called Out of the Dark. And just a little side note, 20 years later, it would be one of the books that the Nazis would burn in their pile of books to be burned when Goebbels did the massive book burning. One of her essays is called The Hand of the World. She writes, "As I write this, I am sitting in a pleasant house, warmly clad, secure against want, sure that my welfare requires the world will give. Sure that what my welfare requires the world will give. Through my surroundings, I feel the touch of a hand, invisible but potent, all-sustaining. The hand that wove my clothes, the hand that stretched this roof over my head, the hand which printed the pages that I read." So I think it's interesting is that I heard somebody talk about materialism and how our age gets criticized as being materialist. And they were like, no, we're consumerist. It's a very different thing. A materialist would recognize the value in material things and would have an interest in knowing how they became how they are, where did they come from, who made them, all these things. And you see Helen Keller, I think it might have something to do with that she lives by touch primarily. I mean, you can only get so far with smell, right. But and taste. It's mostly by touch that she interprets the world, and she's a materialist. She is infinitely interested in who made this thing, how did it get here, what's going on. And then the more she finds out about that, the more enraged she gets about the injustices of the capitalist system. And I don't know, what do you think about that?
That's crazy. I like your definition of materialist versus consumerist. And it sounds like I continue to try to put myself in her shoes, to be lacking in these things, these senses. I mean, they're everything. You can't even begin, you can just try. And, I don't know, she sounds like just her mind and her desire to understand things has to be just burning nonstop. And so she, I couldn't, again, and for her to understand even that there are others who have the similar, not just the similar limitations, but similar hunger, and who will never get it satisfied in the way that she did. And for her to care about that, amazing.
You could not get enough. Like if you do a newspaper search, I was doing newspaper searches from the period of like 1889 is basically when her story busts open, that there's this young girl who can read and write, that can communicate despite being deaf and blind. And then from then until 1913, when she comes out as a socialist and starts speaking out more publicly on manners of injustice, social injustice, and visions of a better world, she's all over the place. And all they want to hear from her is two things, basically. They want her to describe her unique, and which I agree, I'm very curious about it too. What is her internal life like? What is the world like for her? How does she do the things she does? How does she learn? What's her relationship like with her teacher? Is she being controlled by her teacher? Blah, 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 blah. Like very specific details about that relationship. And the other thing they want to hear is, you can do it. If I can do it, you can do it. We can all do it. It's just a matter of putting your head to it. And these are both important things and good messages, right? But as soon as she comes out and talks about, so when she's talking about the stoicism and when she's talking about the adaptability part, people love it. They want to hear all about it. Great model, everything great. But then when she starts talking about the protection part and who's protected in our society, who isn't, who has access to this, who doesn't, they cut the mic. And they start criticizing her.
They want a confirming narrative, man, and that's it. I mean, that's the nature of any set of institutions. But go ahead.
Yeah, they would use the fact that she can't see and that she can't hear, as now it was this. Whereas the same newspaper editors who before were like, "It's so amazing, she's amazing,
Correct.
She's a genius, she can do all these things, blah blah," and now it's like, "Oh, but she can't do this because she's deaf and blind."
Exactly.
It's like it was celebrated when it wasn't criticizing the status quo, and now it's like, well, you can't trust anything she says because she's deaf and blind. And so she would incorporate this into her language. So she said, she's criticizing customs blindly obeyed, and she's talking about how she's coming out of the dark.
Is
so
this
there was all these
shut up and dribble kind of thing.
This is totally a shut up and dribble thing. The problem is they've built her up to be this perfect being. And so now she's turned on them by basically saying that we have to get rid of the capitalist system. And now, so all these newspapers that have, and radios and things like this, who've pumped her up all this time, now have to figure out a way to bring her down. So most of them just do it by not publishing anything about her, ignoring her and ignoring this new perspective of hers, or this perspective that she's going public with now. But a lot of them start to describe her as having been captured as this kind of a victim, kind of a hostage of the communists, of the socialist movement, and that she's clearly not speaking for herself, and this sort of thing. And which
is really not a new tactic. This is something that we just experienced Juneteenth, and today we talk about Martin Luther King Jr. in glowing terms. But when he was alive and doing the great work that he was doing, he was treated with disdain by the biggest media outlets of the time. And in part, one of the things they did was to sort of his associations with like Bayard Rustin and like A. Philip Randolph. These were secular socialist, openly so. And Bayard Rustin, I believe himself, he was also a gay activist. And those affiliations were a way that people would discredit Dr. King as well. King expanded his movement from civil rights for blacks to housing discrimination and workers' rights and anti-Vietnam stuff. You start to say that they're being infiltrated by this and that, when in fact they're making a broader claim, an intersectional claim.
These are really insulting narratives, like incredibly insulting to somebody like a Helen Keller, or who spends so much time reflecting and thinking about how to make the world a better place. And refining her critique and coming up with exactly the right words she wants to use. She's a beautiful writer, and to have somebody then take that from her, that agency from her, and say, "Oh, you're clearly a pawn." It's devastating. It's terrifying.
Right.
Another thing that is happening to her at that point is that a lot of the Espionage Act is put into place in 1917, and along with some other anti-freedom legislation, we'll call it, that ends up putting a lot of her new friends in jail or on blacklists or unable to work, and even somebody she had come to respect and hang out with from time to time was the famous anarchist Emma Goldman, who was deported to Russia. So this was all happening to her. She starts to support the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, and in the labor movement. And I think this choice, because there's many ways in that period to get involved in socialism. And one of the things the IWW had going for it, it's very radical. First of all, they believe in a lot of direct action, wildcat strikes, things like this. But also they're definitely the most inclusive of like the socialist groupings of the time. And that was a big thing for her, because she had no patience whatsoever for any kind of prejudice. And so any labor movement that would not include black workers, women workers, for whatever reason, she was not having it. This is not her revolution. This is not what she's fighting for.
You know what's crazy? Something I was thinking about, with all of her limitations and disadvantages and lack of senses, it fosters, well, obviously this is a limitation. It's also a benefit in this way. It fosters a mindset where she is acutely aware of the fact that there's stuff she doesn't know. There's a built-in kind of humility. So there's known unknowns, and she's constantly prepared to learn more. While I think, while many of us, when we have all of our faculties and all of our senses, there's a bravado and an undue confidence that we get it. I can see this and that, and it's just an interesting way that our brains can develop, I think.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Like no matter how much she would learn, she would know instinctively that she doesn't know everything, just because. Yeah, she's dependent on other people to describe so many things that are happening around her every day, every minute. She's having to learn through another person all the time what's happening in the room around her, what's going on. And when it comes to, one of the things I was a little bit, I wanted to find more about, but it was really hard in the readings that I found, was like really her breakdown of race, like how she understood race growing up in a family that owned slaves before she was born, but growing up with black servants in the house, severely underpaid, mistreated black servants. And there's two things to point out about that. So the first was that her only friend when she was really young was Martha Washington, who was the daughter of the cook. And so obviously Helen's blind, so she can't perceive blackness visually, but she understood instinctively, even before she understood language. She understood she could get away with things with Martha. So she says, Martha understood my signs. And at that point, her signs are very basic. They're just kind of like, I want food. This is mine. Something, stuff like this. And she says, I seldom had difficulty in making Martha do everything I wished. It pleased me to domineer over her, and she generally submitted to my tyranny. So this is her writing in her 20s about her early years before she learned language. And so this is somebody who's feeling a lot of anger about her reality, and she's getting pleasure out of taking it out on somebody that she's been able to understand, even without seeing and hearing, that even without understanding the language, that she can get away with things with this. She doesn't even know the word black, but there's something about Martha that she can she knows she's above her on the hierarchy. She can,
something about Martha, something about her family, something about the society, there's something here.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. And there's a moment where, after they're able to talk now, at this point, once Helen has this ability to speak with Anne, where something happens and Helen's super angry at one of the servants named Viney, and Helen asks Anne to ask her mom to whip the servant, and Anne immediately goes on a hunger strike and a silent strike, and just refuses to speak to Helen, to be her pathway to the world, and refuses to eat. And you actually see Helen feeling Anne's plate, I'm reading the autobiography, and realizing that Anne's not eating, and she's going on hunger strike in protest of what this 8-year-old has said, or what she's asked for. And Anne would not eat or speak to Helen until she apologized to Viney for having said this. And this is all happening with signs. So these are just like, this was what happened in the home, I think, that helped her develop this thing. Go ahead.
Talk about the privilege, the luck of having this particular teacher to teach those lessons, and not just mouth them or spell them out, but to like put them in practice, the values and power and standing up for something, and having her understand the ways that she's done something wrong. We can all benefit from some of that.
Yeah, and she definitely benefited because, this was what prepared her to later on develop a long friendship with W.B. Du Bois, and the founder of the NAACP, and she actually contributed to his newspaper. And she once wrote in another essay, and I think this was like kind of one of the more. She didn't talk much about race and segregation. She made herself abundantly clear a few times, and then just had like no patience for it. It seems like it's just. And so she said, "This revolt has never slumbered within me since I begin to notice for myself how she's talking about black people, are degraded, and with what cold-blooded deliberation the keys of knowledge, self-reliance, and well-paid employment are taken from them." I think that's just an interesting list, that they're being denied an appropriate education. This is somebody who has had education open up everything for her, and she's become aware that this is being denied, and this is like one of the greatest injustices. And I think this is one that is definitely applicable to today, where we see like one of the greatest inequalities in our world is about that overlaps with color is education, right? I think in terms of public education systems and stuff.
Absolutely. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Self-reliance.
To me, and all of that can be traced back to just the early experiences that we have when our brains are forming, our associations with love and respect and trust, and how we relate to our parents and other figures that are authority figures, and how they relate to us. If you don't get a proper grounding in that, it's crazy. And I think that's, I don't know what the percentages are. Some major percentage of our youth population today just simply will not be provided for as a foundational like premise for them to go forth and like live a fucking productive life.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
I don't know. It's horrifying.
So she's way ahead of just like voting rights, and like she's not on the topic of the day. She's not like, oh, the topic of the day is voting rights and desegregation of schools. She's already at like, no, this is everything a human needs for dignity. So not everybody's a fan of Helen Keller, and I'm glad.
I'm not a fan of Helen Keller.
I'm glad. There's I'm gonna screw up her name, Georgina Klieg, I believe is her name. Georgina Klieg
okay.
is a professor. She's blind, and she is a professor at Berkeley.
My complicated relationship with Helen Keller came from childhood. She was held up as this role model, that she was deaf and blind, but she was always cheerful and she did well in school and you never heard her complain. I took this very personally. I took it as a reproach towards me. So I hated Helen Keller, and I loved Helen Keller jokes, and I, told them with relish in the schoolyard.
Yeah.
So she hates Helen Keller because Helen Keller provided a very difficult, nearly impossible standard that everyone's sort of then judging other people by, huh?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And I think the problem here is clearly not Helen Keller.
Right.
The problem is the way that media and stuff would talk about Helen Keller.
Right.
And she definitely Helen Keller definitely was an optimist. And she has a whole essay called Optimism. It's a long essay. She has it as a philosophy, basically. Like it's part of her approach to the world, a conscious decision to remain optimistic. And I can see how when there's no other model, like literally no other models, like this is the blind, particularly if you're a woman, this is like the blind woman, and she's also deaf. So what are you complaining about?
Yeah.
It's like,
right.
Imagine.
Yeah. Jesus. Yeah. Do you remember Christopher Hitchens? Of course you do.
Yeah, of course. Mostly through your impressions of Christopher Hitchens. Yeah.
Wait, do you remember his? He wrote a screed about Mother Teresa.
Oh yeah, the documentary.
Yeah, it was a documentary and I think a series of essays, if not an essay or a book.
I saw the documentary.
Called The Missionary Position. I mean, how disrespectful could that be? But
why you don't like the missionary position? You're anti-missionary position? Or
it's a great position. It's a great position. I'm for a suite. I'm for a suite of positions. But you take this person who seems above reproach, and then you knock him down a peg. I think what Christopher Hitchens did with Mother Teresa seems stronger than what Georgina was doing. Seems like Mother Teresa there were some legitimate things we could say about her.
Oh yeah.
It's a simple matter of record that she was a fanatic and a fundamentalist and a fraud. I think probably the most successful confidence trickster of the last century, and responsible for innumerable deaths and for untold suffering and misery, and proud of it. Should I just assert this, or would you require any proof?
Georgina's talking specifically about her relationship to the story of Helen Keller that was presented to her.
Gotcha.
I think whereas what Christopher Hitchens doing is like a deep investigation revealing that the Mother Teresa that was given to us is not the Mother Teresa that actually walked the earth, and that she actually played a key role in upholding a lot of injustices and I think this. So I think that's
how important is the narrative, Jess? The narratives, yo. Like, who gets to dictate the narratives? Who gets to use the words? Who gets to come up with the words in the first place, and then use them and apply them here and there, and sort of shift our focus and narrow our focus and say this is the issue. This is the thing you should be looking at, or this is the way you should be looking at this person. All the people we've talked about, they're famous people. And they've done all these things in an objective way, and then you've got this layer of the media personas and the hype and the stories that have been told about them that's outside of their control, you know. And then we all have to we're all dealing with that story versus, you know, unless you do a deep dive and really try to look.
And Helen Keller was like super aware of this concept just because her day-to-day reality was one of dependence on other people for understanding what's happening and what's going on. So she always needed to have somebody who could speak with her to be her medium through which she would understand the news or what's going on in the world or anything like this. And that became a real problem. It's like one of the things that Helen Keller had to deal with was people trying to exploit her, because she's an international star who's heavily dependent on different people, and her teacher Anne was definitely had control issues. Wanted total control over Helen, and didn't like anybody else speaking directly to her except people that she knew well, like some of her other closer friends, like Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone. Helen was very aware, and like a lot of wealthy liberal tycoon type characters wanted to help Helen Keller because she needed money always. She can't work herself, and she kind of lived off the philanthropy of some of these tycoons, and she didn't like that. So like, for example, Andrew Carnegie was somebody she deeply distrusted. This is the guy who donated I don't know how many millions of dollars and built all the public libraries and all these things, and is probably an example of a philanthropist who made a big impact on life for many people in the U.S. But when he offered to give her a lifetime pension of $5,000 a year for her life, which would have alleviated a ton of challenges for her, she rejected it, and she said that at some point Carnegie actually threatened to put her over his knee and spank the socialism out of her, because she said he was a steel magnate, like he had made his money through exploiting steel workers and miners and things, and that was her thing. It was like, I'm not taking your dirty money. Wow. You know, I don't want to help clean your image after all the damage you've done. And his response was like, I'm going to spank the socialism out of you. The sad part of the story is at some point later on in the story, years later, he maintains that offer out there, and Anne got a horrible flu at some point, and they had no money, and she eventually accepted the offer when she was in a really desperate situation, and Anne was in a really desperate situation. Her father wanted to put her in the circus at one point. Her father had lost his job, and but this thing is like relative poverty. It's like they still have servants, they still own land, they still have all these things, and he's like, before giving up on any of these things he's become accustomed to, he's ready to put her in the circus. And so
this is before everything, right? This is before she begins to learn all the things that she learns.
No, this is after. This is like put her in the circus as like, so the circus thing come and went as throughout her teenage years. And so she's learned now to talk, and that's what she would be on display. It would be like, come see the girl that's in all the newspapers on earth. Gotcha. Come watch her talk and read lips, because she could, she was brilliant. Like she could just put her hand on your face and know what you're saying. And so, but if you see who she chose, so she was able to realize at an early age, I think, that people there's exploitation's a thing even in her life, and who controls the message and who controls what I guess is really important. And it's really interesting when you look at the friends that she chose and who she kept close to her. And I think Alexander Graham Bell was somebody who actually discovered the telephone a little by accident while he was trying to develop a way for deaf people to hear. His mom was deaf and his wife was deaf. And then after developing the telephone, he took the money he made off the telephone and put it all in like betting on that technology, which didn't pan out in his lifetime, but today is a real thing. There's a lot of people that would have been deaf in previous years that now can hear, and he was a big part in moving that along. And Mark Twain, which is his pen name, but Samuel Clemens was his real name. Yeah. It's another person, but also like all her friends seemed to be people that had gone through great challenges in their life. So Mark Twain lost a daughter, lost his wife to illnesses, but all these people, she surrounded herself with people who had lived real shit, had a sense of perspective, had values that they were coherent about, that they applied across race, class, gender, all these things, and were always intelligent, witty people. So I think it's interesting in terms of like who she chose to surround herself with. I give her an A+ on her friend choices. W.B. Du Bois and
Real talk.
Emma Goldman, Mark Twain, Alexander Graham Bell. She did great.
That's crazy. I should think about how do you even, I guess obviously those are all very famous people, but I think about the ways that today, if you were in those circles, you could just, go in someone's DM on Instagram or something. Like, how do you even get in contact with Alexander Graham Bell?
Yeah.
But it's fantastic.
They went in person. So they were told, oh, they said it was Helen's mom who had written an article written by Charles Dickens decades earlier about Laura Bridgman, or years earlier, about Laura Bridgman, who was the first deaf blind person to learn to communicate. And they told, she's at the Perkins School, talk to Alexander Graham Bell, he can set you up. And so Alexander Graham Bell is actually the guy who ends up setting up her teacher, Annie, who had learned to speak with Laura Bridgman directly when she was at the School for the Blind. Annie, by the way, got to the School for the Blind when the director of the School for the Blind was on a tour of the homeless shelter, and Annie just like ran up and grabbed him and said, I want to learn, I want to learn, I want to learn. And that's because, she had grown up in this homeless shelter, and she was just living her brother had just died of tuberculosis in the homeless shelter, or not just years earlier or whatever, and she had been raped, and she just had this horrible, horrible childhood of abandonment and betrayal and of trust and all stuff. And she just decided education was going to be her way out of this, and grabbed this guy and like would not let him go until he agreed to let her into the School for the Blind. And she hated it there because she said she preferred hanging out with the sex workers at the homeless shelter because they were more real and less judgmental. And she found most of the kids that could afford to go to the School for the Blind were very wealthy, and she didn't like them too much. The only one she got along with was Laura Bridgman, who was deaf and blind. And that's how she learned to speak it, and then that's how she ends up becoming Helen Keller's teacher.
Nice.
There it is, man.
Interesting. Wow. Jesus. That's a full life, Sometimes I read these stories of these people. Obviously these are exceptional people. I think most people didn't do those things, and that's okay. But you hear these stories of extreme triumph through civil war and like weird tooth decay issues, the social
Wait, what?
and the biological. Well, what I'm saying,
that took a weird turn.
The experiences we have, our trials are still as valid but very different,
I see what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, people were dying from wisdom teeth,
Right.
regularly. The complications of childbirth are still, we haven't perfected it, but it was so much worse back then, and it was just a constant state of potential harm, or it feels that way. Obviously they were able to like find happiness and enjoy and live a life, but it feels like it was just constant all the time, and you go, man. And so she taught herself all these things, and these people were able to learn English in spite of all these oppressive systems all over them. Weird.
And every time when she tells her stories, these little anecdotes of her life, they're just infused with this kind of, even the crazy stuff, like almost getting run over by a train, having no idea what's happening, and hanging from the bridge and stuff. Like they're just infused with this kind of like joyful gratefulness for having lived the experience, like regardless how terrible or terrifying it. I just go back to that quote is just in my head when she says like, I lived myself into all things, but then she recognized that she had certain help and certain privileges, and that allowed her to keep finding new things and not getting stuck in one existence. And so she wanted those opportunities for everybody, and until her dying day she fought.
Insane. Jesse, I take your case for Helen Keller, and I see it and I approve of it. I think that she's as advertised. She's dope. Someone to look at and a model, I think. Hopefully without, if you can find a way to not be bogged down with the expectation that you match her awesomeness, sound like our lady, like if you can just take the meat of her narrative and her approach and like apply it, I'm down. She seems dope.
Yeah, she was a beautiful, beautiful person who went up against tremendous, tremendous challenges and used those challenges to make herself and, in my case, the world a better place.
Agreed.
Bam. Done. Billy.
My man. Yes. Just thanks, man.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Now
any last thoughts on I just wonder if you have any thoughts on given the current situation, the current state of affairs, allyship. What does it mean to be a good ally? And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. There's a recent video released called "I Take Responsibility." I don't know if you saw this. Different actors and stuff, and it's been roundly criticized as like.
I didn't see the video.
Oh, okay, well it's pretty painful
really?
to watch. Knowing that they're actors, it feels just feels like a bit much, and it's been kind of roundly criticized for kind of putting the focus on themselves, and it's like there's clearly some overacting going on, and anyways,
I didn't see the video, but I can tell what the sort of tone of it probably is, and what is a good ally is the question. So an ally, so this is someone who is participating in a struggle while not being of the group while not being directly harmed in the same way as the main group, right? Participating.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I would call it. I would argue based on the work of James Baldwin that we're all affected by injustices.
Mm-hmm.
I always love that quote he has when he says, he was talking about seeing the police officer in the South clubbing this woman at a nonviolent protest and saying, what's happening to this black woman is barbaric and it's horrible, but at some level what's happening inside the heart of that policeman is like as terrible. I don't know exactly what words he uses, just to have him in a state where he can do something like this. Anyway, so just to say, I think when you remove injustices, life gets better for everybody.
Exactly.
And but yeah, so on this point, it would be like to be a white person in solidarity with the Black liberation movement or Black Lives Matter.
I think on there are a ton of things I could say that are practical things to do, like go to this website and speak, but I think on a very fundamental level, it is to like engage in that conversation in a deep and serious way. That conversation thing I tried to touch on earlier about the volleys between, honesty and empathy, over and over, to constantly go back to that, even though it's difficult and even though it'll probably be weird and there'll be things you won't understand, like necessarily, because you're an ally, you're outside of the experience, perhaps. So you're trying to listen and you're trying to understand and you're sharing your information. And once you do that, I think, and you have some good partnership with the group, with the people in the group who can help and provide the honesty for you to grow from, like other things will come. Once you're really doing that, I think in a genuine way, like the practical application of a set of like things will go. So I think it's weird because, as we're all kind of dealing with this current situation, we're trying to figure out how we should move in it. Sometimes you hear it's people's expression of people's desire to see allyship manifest in certain ways. So like, did the white person change their profile picture on Facebook into a black thing, and that's an expression of allyship, but it's an expression. It's part of a much broader thing. Like if you're looking for that, you may find that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're dealing with someone who's a genuine ally. That's a performance of a kind, and sometimes performance is part of it, but it's not.
Sometimes it's the first step. Sometimes I change my profile picture and then I try to live up to it. It's like, okay, now I'm going to try to live up to this profile picture of mine.
Exactly. So it's like when we try to understand who's who, and we try to like, it's like we got to do both, and we've got to just. The real question isn't profile pictures or statements or whatever. It's like a continual conversation, and having someone really purposefully, consciously, deliberately walk towards that conversation and approach and say, I'm ready to learn, I'm ready to share and learn.
There was this article that a lot of white folks were sharing around that was like, whenever a black person is expressing something they've lived, the correct response is, I see you, I'm sorry, that must be awful, or that's awful. And that's what you're supposed to say. It's like a script or something, right? And then a bunch of people were posting it with writing, I see you, I'm sorry, that's awful. And while I get the spirit of what the article was trying to say, which is like, I just was imagining this like army of white people walking around just being like, I see you, I'm sorry, that's awful. Exactly. And it's like totally the opposite of what you're describing, which is like a very real attempt at vulnerability and empathy and sharing, and like seeing eye to eye and stuff like that. So I just, there's like, things are going in a lot of different directions.
That's hilarious. That's exactly right. But again, it's, you just, you want, it's hard to measure that conversation from an external space watching, it's just, so we try to find the points that we can determine as like indicators, and some of those are valid ways to try to understand, but it's, but we're talking about something more.
But that's why I wanted to
Allyship is.
And that's why I wanted to do somebody today who I thought was a model, because I think you can learn a lot more by modeling a person than like trying to figure out how you're supposed to respond to every possible situation. It's like try to like, and then be able to ask yourself, what would Helen Keller do? What would what would Jesus do? What would whatever? It's
Jesus
like
do?
I think like there's a lot more power in that. And I think it's a more complete and thorough way of becoming a better person. In general, than trying to figure out how I'm supposed to respond. Like, what's the right response in this situation? What am I supposed to say? Blah, 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 So
yeah, exactly.
Helen Keller is a model ally. All right, man. Much love.
Thank you, bro.
Episode 6 is done.
Yes.
And let's go into the day.
I'll find out what the next episode is. I'll be doing some thinking, and it'll be my turn to play lead. Jesse, you did an excellent job, and I appreciate you, man. Until next time, bro.
Yes, sir. Remember to like, subscribe, reviews, whatever you do. Billy and I want
all of it.
We want to talk. We're hot to chat.
And share.
And if you have any reflections, you can hit us up at whereisnowshow@gmail.com.